Welcome back to World History 24, where my older sister Ellie teaches me world history in order in just 24 hours. My name is Charlie. In our last episode, Ellie took us on a world tour to visit China, the Mediterranean, Kerma, Poverty Point in North America, and the Austronesians in the Pacific. We covered the Late Bronze Age, a time when the Earth was dotted with massive empires and smaller communities with distinct cultures and organizational structures that varied widely from their neighbors. In this episode, we'll cover from 1200 to 800 BCE. Ellie takes us back to the corner of Afro-Eur-Asia to witness the dramatic close of the Bronze Age, the rise of a new metal, a new empire, and the origins of a new religion. In India, we'll see a new spiritual movement in Sanskrit. And finally, in Mesoamerica, our final so-called cradle. So without further ado, let's call Ellie and continue the magnificent story of human history.
So episode 4, we're going to cover the time period between 1200 BCE and 800 BCE. And we're going to begin the episode in that world that we spent some time in episode 3, that world that contains the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. It contains Egypt and Nubia.
The Bronze Age world.
Exactly, that Bronze Age world. And we're going to talk about the very late Bronze Age and what happens.
Cool. And when you say world in this context, you just mean like that space.
I do mean that space, but I also mean the way that it's all interconnected and sort of behaves as one unit. So as we talked about, remember in episode 3, we talked about that shipwreck that had like the products from all over, it had glass from this place and gold from that place. And, that interconnectedness is where we're going to start. Of course, this world is filled with different kingdoms and different city-states, and they don't speak the same language, and they don't have the same religions, and they don't have the same customs. On the other hand, they are so intertwined as to be very dependent on each other.
Right. Cool.
As we said, there's lots of trade, and there's lots of cultural exchange. There's always like the king of this place wants the king of this other place to send their artists to make a sculpture for his palace, or you want musicians to come from a different land to play at your party to show how cool and cosmopolitan you are. And what's interesting is that over time, Akkadian, which goes all the way back to episode 2, Akkadian is like the language of the northern people of Mesopotamia. Akkadian becomes kind of like the lingua franca of this entire Bronze Age world. So even though it isn't the language that any of them are speaking, really, it's the language that they all use to communicate with each other. We have all these letters back and forth from people in these different countries. The leaders all call each other brother. The letters are so human to the point where sometimes they're sort of snippy. So there's like, an example of like a Babylonian king writing to an Egyptian king when he doesn't feel like he got the proper amount of gold. And he's like, certainly my brother, the king of Egypt, didn't check the earlier shipment of gold, or like God. This would never have happened, and like
the passive aggression has started to
exactly
creep into writing.
Yeah. Exactly. So we have tablets, this is going back to episode 2, we have tablets of King Hammurabi refusing a gift of Minoan shoes, and we have an Egyptian queen who was widowed, and she's probably King Tutankhamun, like King Tut's widow, sending a letter to the Hittite ruler saying, my husband has died and I have no son. They say about you that you have many sons, and you might give me one of your sons to become my husband. I would not wish to take one of my subjects as a husband, I am afraid. Yeah, so King Tut's widow, writing to the Hittite rulers. We haven't talked much about the Hittites, but that's another one of these big, civilizations in this world, saying, send me one of your sons, send me a prince. And one thing I will say about this exact example is that he does send a son. The son dies along the way, and there's some speculation that it was a trap.
Wow.
It was like, send me your crown prince and then we'll murder him. So whatever. Who knows? Long time ago.
Damn.
But anyway, yes, political intrigue, all of that.
Cool. Love it.
It also makes it interesting because then when there's like a war or an event like that, you can read about it from both sides, which is just interesting, because both sides are literate. So the last thing I want to say about the interconnectedness of the world is tin. So we've talked about, the Bronze Age. The recipe for bronze is copper and tin. Tin is like oil is to the modern world. That metaphor is used over and over again. Everything depends on the flow of tin and the flow of copper as well, but copper is just a little more abundant. Certainly the wealth and the strength and the security of any given empire or any given ruler depends upon their ability to deliver tin.
Okay.
Because
I see what you're saying.
Weapons as well as all manner of other things are made of bronze. Yeah.
Sure.
So if you can't produce bronze for your people, you're toast. Okay, so then that's all going along fine, all through, our last episode or whatever. And then in this incredibly short window, which can practically be dated between like 1207 and 1177, although, some of the events are outside of that. But this very, very short window of just a few decades, unbelievable disaster just ripples across this entire late Bronze Age world. City after city burn, palaces burn. There's so much mayhem in that archaeological layer all the way across thousands of miles. Bodies that are burnt, people with arrowheads in them. Hattusa, which is the capital of the Hittite Empire, the walls and roofs collapse and are burned. We can see that happened. There's this port city in northern Syria called Ugarit, which is just this incredibly cool city. It's very diverse and interesting. We have tablets in the rubble of it that are in 7 different languages. So it was just very cosmopolitan. And also in the destruction of it, we found the oldest written piece of music on the whole earth.
This piece is called Hurrian Hymn Number 6, and as Ellie said, it is the oldest written melody we have ever been able to transcribe into modern music. The cuneiform tablet, which we found in the rubble of Ugarit, instructs the musician in tuning, intervals, and movement on a 9-string Babylonian lyre. Without quick access to a Babylonian lyre, I retuned my 12-string guitar, following some of the many modern transcriptions.
That city was just leveled during this period, and there's this famous heartbreaking letter that we found in the wreckage, which goes, "My father, behold, the enemy ships come here. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Luca? Thus my country is abandoned to itself. May my father know it. The 7 ships of the enemy have come and inflicted much damage upon us."
Jeez. So, what is going on? Why is this all happening all at once?
Yeah, okay, so we're going to get to that. The last example I want to give of this is Troy. So there is an actual city that we think is probably the city that, Troy of the Trojan War, that Troy. And that's in southern Turkey. And again, like when you read about this in the sort of mythology, they talk about how the walls are so big and so immense that, Poseidon must have built them, or Apollo or whatever, like these are major, major pieces of architecture. And we haven't found evidence of an actual Trojan horse or anything, but there is evidence that at this period it was sacked and burned. And there's bodies with arrows in them and burned bodies and whatever. I mean, there clearly was some disaster, whether or not it was exactly the Trojan War as laid out in the Iliad, Egypt survives this, but it's never the same. And it's just, civilization after civilization. again, this only happens in a few decades. So, of course, like, what happened? I mean,
right. What happened? I mean, the destruction you're describing is taking place over such a massive area in this Bronze Age world. Like, why would it be so ubiquitous?
Exactly. Like, that is the question, right? So there's an Egyptian pharaoh, Ramses III, who writes about these groups of people attacking Egypt, and he refers to them by all these different names, but scholars now largely refer to them collectively as the Sea People. So if you learned about the Bronze Age collapse in high school, you probably learned about the Sea People. And in this book that I read called 1177 by Eric Klein, he says that the Sea People are always described like a alien movie where, like, suddenly out of nowhere, a group appears and just city after city gets taken out one after the other.
Wow. Yeah. Right.
But now that's not, we no longer think that. And what we actually think is in some ways much more alarming. And what we think is that so the world is so connected, as we talked about, and a series of things that are sort of unrelated began to go wrong. Climate change, for example. In some parts of this Bronze Age world, the world got a little bit colder. That starts to mess with your crops. There may have been a volcano on this northern island of Hekla, which, then would mess up your crops or...
Sure.
There's all this evidence of famine, maybe due to this climate change, maybe due to other things. And there's all these letters back and forth from the king saying, like, my people are starving, like, please send grain. And, there's just a lot of evidence of famine. There is tiny bits of evidence that there might have been some epidemics, like some diseases that swept through, although it's hard because epidemics don't really leave evidence, really, in the archaeological record very well. What we now think is that these series of slightly unrelated things began happening, and they just dominoed in this way that creates a tidal wave. So, like, this group of people in this city, there's climate change and their crops fail. And so they get angry and they, like, attack their own king. And then that king's trade route gets disrupted. And then these groups over here and here suddenly don't have enough money to feed their people. And then this creates a refugee crisis. And then the refugees overwhelm the neighboring kingdoms, and then on and on and on. And so now they think what we used to think of as these sea people were probably like groups of refugees, and then, militaries that had turned on their own government or were escaping their own government. And so they were a bunch of, like, armed soldiers looking for a place to leave or whatever. So some of these places just fall, just quote unquote fall to kind of natural circumstances. Others do get invaded, endless refugee crisis, and just literally in a few decades, basically every major player in the late Bronze Age is wiped.
Dude, that is so crazy. I like, you're describing some, like, kind of like a world that's interconnected and strong for its interconnection, and then also is kind of very fragile as well.
Absolutely.
In the sense that, like, maybe just a little bit of climate change or something, an epidemic or something like that. I mean,
I know.
It's a little hard to talk about right now, to be honest.
No, it really is. It really is. And of course, of course, we now live in a world where, like, every event in every country affects everyone else. I mean, there's no,
exactly.
Yeah, 100%.
Wow. crazy. Okay. And what now? Where do we go from here?
Well, yeah. So one thing that's probably pretty predictable is that when something like that happens, it creates a power vacuum.
Sure.
And some groups end up thriving in that power vacuum. And so in a minute, we're going to talk about Canaan, and we're going to talk about the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. And these are the ancestors of the people who end up writing the Bible. And their kingdoms definitely sort of are allowed to flourish and grow as some of these groups that have been trampling all over this land disappear. But first, we're going to talk about the Assyrian Empire, which becomes a huge empire in this power vacuum. All right, so the Assyrian Empire is our first giant Iron Age empire, and it's the blueprint for all empires going forward. So we've left the Bronze Age behind, it's collapsed around us, and now we're walking into this thing that historians call the Iron Age.
Before Ellie gets too deep into the Assyrians, I just wanted to talk for a minute about iron and the Iron Age. You may remember in episode 1 when I said that the way we use the word age is very context dependent. Copper, stone, bronze, iron ages usually refer to the period when that material became widespread in the Mediterranean world and China, often somewhat ignoring the rest of the globe's technology. So as we move into the Iron Age, it's important to know that iron had been in use already for centuries in some parts of the world, most notably in Central Africa, where we find evidence of the Bantu people smelting iron in 1800 BCE. That's 600 years before the Iron Age. And if you're curious, we will definitely talk way more about the Bantu in our next episode. The Earth's crust is about 5% iron, so it's relatively easy to find, but not as easy to use, as it melts at 1500 degrees Celsius. That's 400 degrees hotter than copper or bronze. And basically, different cultures at different times discovered and mastered different techniques to make their kilns hot enough for the job. As Ellie said, the Assyrians were the first major empire to make widespread use of iron. They certainly weren't the first culture to smelt it. But by protecting their armies with iron helmets or iron shin guards, they gained enormous military advantage over their bronze-wielding enemies.
So the height of the Neo-Assyrian Empire that we're going to talk about is from roughly 911 to 610 BCE. And what's true about it is that no state in history had ever been as large and as rich and powerful as it is at its height. This type of world empire is an entirely new thing on the earth, and it essentially has no competitors.
Wow. Okay. What do people mean when they say like the height of a thing?
Well, that's a really good point. I mean, in a lot of ways, it just means the time when it's the biggest and the most powerful.
Kind of like controlling the most land, or?
Yes. Okay, and in the case of the Assyrians, that's really important. I mean, you'd like to think it means when they were writing their best literature.
Yeah, like best to their people or whatever,
right,
you know.
Right. And a lot of times, I mean, sometimes those things coexist, but yeah.
Sure.
No, yeah. That's a really good question. So where are we? We are back in Mesopotamia, and the heart of the Assyrian Empire is specifically in northern Mesopotamia, so where the modern countries of Turkey and Syria and Iraq meet. And as you know from episode 2, people have been there for thousands of years, and the Assyrians are very aware of this history. They view themselves as the holders of this ancient and important grand tradition. And so there's all this writing about Gilgamesh and Sargon the Great and all these other sort of leaders that we talked about in episode 2, who at this point are as far away from the Assyrians as Julius Caesar is from us. You know, it's very easy to just be like ancient history, it's all the same. But
right, you kind of accordion all those dates closer together in the past. Yeah.
It's like very easy to think like, oh, it's all just ancient history or whatever. But in fact, they're viewing themselves as the holders of this grand, very long, very ancient tradition. So there's a few important cities in the Assyrian Empire. They make a triangle. So there's Ashur and then Nineveh, which has this very important and famous temple to Ishtar in it, and then Arbela. And the centering city, the one that sort of gives it its entire identity, is this city of Ashur. And
the city that gives the Assyrians their identity.
Exactly. Okay. And it is on the west bank of the Tigris River. So as you remember, the Tigris and Euphrates are the two rivers that run through Mesopotamia. The Tigris is sort of the more like exciting one that is a little bit more volatile, and the Euphrates is a little more chill. And so it's on the west bank of the Tigris. And when I say it gives it its identity, this is sort of what I mean. So if you remember, we talked very briefly about the way that the gods and the cities in Mesopotamia relate to each other. And each god is associated with one city, and it's almost like a patron god, but it's much stronger than that. It's like the identity of the god and the identity of the city are the same. And so if two cities are warring with each other, the two gods are warring with each other. And if a city is doing very well, then that means the god is doing very well. And so as the Assyrian Empire takes over, it starts telling all these other places it conquers that their gods are sort of manifestations of Ashur. And so one thing that's very true and will come up over and over again is that the dichotomy between monotheism and polytheism is like very gray, actually. And so I wouldn't say that the Assyrian Empire is monotheistic exactly, but they're certainly like trending that way and starting to be like, all these other gods, feel free to keep, offering sacrifices or whatever. But these are actually just manifestations of the real one, who's just the god with like kind of a capital T, capital G. So now we're just going to talk really quickly kind of about like who are the Assyrians. And I feel like if you learned about them in high school, the thing that you probably learned is that they're really brutal. That's what they're so famous for, is they're just constantly talking about impaling people and flaying people and burning them alive and violating the purity of the maidens and whatever. I mean, it's just that's like their whole thing. I think that we should take that with a slight grain of salt, although also don't, because I think they really were really mean. But that's a tactic. So throughout history, we see other people using it, like Genghis Khan or the pirates that are in the Caribbean, a few hundred years ago, where they do something that is, in fact, sort of horrible and cruel. And then they brag about it as loudly as they can. And they're like, go tell everyone that I'm the most scary, vicious, pitiless monster in the world. Right. Yeah. So, because then when I show up to your city gate, you're like, oh my gosh, it's that one. And you immediately give them whatever they want, you just surrender.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So the Assyrians, I feel like, are very, very remembered for their cruelty. And I don't doubt that they were cruel. And I also just think we should take some of it with a grain of salt. This intense violence and these intimidation tactics and these threats were also directed at their own people, and specifically at their women. And this is one very important legacy of the Assyrian Empire. It's never like a great time to be a woman in the ancient world. I don't think there's like very many places or times throughout the ancient world that I would describe as like feminist, but this sort of starts something really new where men and women are like entirely different. And so when you read their law codes, it's just every possible, like men can ask for a divorce and women can't, or like, quote, if a woman has procured a miscarriage by her own act, when they have prosecuted her and convicted her, they shall impale her on stakes without burying her.
Holy shit.
So death penalty for an abortion.
Right. Oh my God.
Women start to not be able to go into the street without their heads covered. And that only applies to kind of married women and upper class women. And then very specifically, if you're, so harlots and maidservants who cover themselves shall have their garments seized. They shall be beaten with 50 blows and shall have bitumen poured over their heads.
Jesus Christ.
Right.
Okay.
So it's like cover your head unless you're a harlot, in which case, if you cover your head, we'll kill you.
So earlier in the podcast or in time, the sort of early Copper Age cultures, we talked about as some of them as being like pretty egalitarian or pretty like a good amount of equality between men and women. And then some of the other civilizations that we've talked about certainly have not embodied that. And then this is just like the most extreme.
Yeah, this is just on a whole different level. I mean, it's just a whole different level.
Okay.
And then it also starts adding all these things like the men are forced to be complicit. Like another law that I want to read is if a gentleman has seen a harlot covered and has let her go without bringing her to the palace tribunal, they shall flog that gentleman 50 times with staves. They shall pierce his ears, thread them with a cord, and tie it at his back. Meaning, it's like if you realize women are breaking these laws and you don't do anything about it, it's on you.
Right. And you'll be punished.
Right.
Like you
violently.
have to.
Yeah.
Right.
And so it just creates this entire, like, it's on all of the men to keep all of the women in check. And women start to be completely invisible in society. They have to have their heads covered. And then the most powerful and important women, like the wives and concubines of the kings, are like completely behind like locked doors. And there's all these rules about like the only men that can talk to them are eunuchs. And even they can't without permission, and horrible violence is threatened to them if they stand too close or talk too long. So this is one of the important legacies of the Assyrian Empire, is just this rigid division. And although we don't actually know how these laws were enforced, to what extent they were enforced, it does seem as though the just violent misogyny running through them, has to be reflective of some type of reality in the society. So as is true with every 30 seconds of this podcast, there's like entire books written about all these different Assyrian kings and exactly what they did. But the rough story is just that post Bronze Age collapse, they start expanding. There's periods where they don't expand as much. And in fact, they even shrink back into a much smaller space. And then they go out and expand again. And the result of that is that frequently these kings feel as though they're conquering land that ought already to belong to them, because some previous Assyrian king had ruled it. And that is a classic historical move, to be like, I'm not conquering, I'm taking something back.
Yeah, definitely. Giving Putin vibes.
Exactly. What their second big legacy has to do with all this expansion. And that is kind of the blueprint for a way that an empire works. So there's been empires for several episodes now, for several thousand years. But largely what that meant was that you would kind of conquer another group of people and then be like, give us a lot of tribute, pay us a lot of taxes and don't rise up. And then as long as you do those things, you can kind of keep your identity and live your life.
Okay.
So their big legacy is to kind of say, all these lands that I've conquered are part of us. There's only one people, there's one group, and we're all Assyrian.
Okay, I see.
And then they set up these governors, these sort of small kingships throughout the Assyrian Empire, and those are very related to their military. So military service becomes mandatory. And being high up in the military and being a powerful politician are very synonymous.
Okay.
And one of the ways that they force everyone into this kind of Assyrian identity is through this heartbreaking policy called their relocation policy. What the relocation policy is picking up entire groups of people and just moving them to a different part of the Assyrian Empire and just plopping them down there.
Wow. Right. Okay.
Yeah, it's really intense. And then they just get a different group of people and put them in the land that you just left empty. And the purpose is so that is to break those ties, to be like, you're Assyrian, you're not from this kingdom or this part of the world or these group of people. You're just Assyrian. And of course it works.
Yeah, if you've lost your homeland, your house, your family ties to a certain place, that makes sense.
Exactly. And one of the things that's really intense to read about is the way that the Assyrians actually write about this policy. And they don't write, there's no acknowledgement of kind of the inherent brutality of uprooting people from their homeland. Instead, they write about it as though they're gardeners that are lovingly transplanting trees to where they ought to be.
Wow.
I'm just tending to my empire and putting everyone where they should be.
Wow, this really seems like a pretty awesome place to be, honestly. Really,
I know. And we'll talk a little bit about one of the last kings who built this great library and stuff in our next episode, because they also have beautiful art and music and all these other things,
right.
But just kind of their legacies are these kind of brutal things. So in the end of the Assyrian Empire, which is actually kind of dipping into our timeline for our next episode, but we're going to just say it here, more than 1.5 million people have been deported like this.
Whoa.
Yeah.
By this deportation policy or the relocation policy.
Relocation policy, exactly. So in 150 years, more than 1.5 million. Yeah.
Wow. Jeez.
And famously, one of the groups that gets moved like this is the Israelites.
Okay.
And so if you've heard of the 10 lost tribes of Israel, this is them. This is where they're being lost to, into the Assyrian Empire.
In case you don't know the 10 lost tribes of Israel, it's a story from the Bible that begins with a wrestling match between God and a man named Jacob. You'd think it'd be a sure win for God, but Jacob holds his own for a whole night. Eventually, God calls it a draw and says, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you've struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." In Hebrew, Israel means he who wrestles with God. Jacob, now named Israel, has 12 sons and grandsons that each give rise to a tribe. These are the 12 tribes of Israel. Later in the Bible, when the Assyrians conquer the kingdom of Israel, they deport 10 of the 12 tribes. These are the 10 lost tribes of Israel. This biblical retelling of the Assyrian deportation event has been used in biblical religious conspiracies to explain various mysteries throughout history. In an ongoing pattern of anti-Semitism, people the world over have been accused of being or conspiring with one of these lost tribes, and causing everything from the bubonic plague to the Mongol invasion. The lost tribe myth has also been used by surprisingly reputable archaeologists to connect dots in humanity's shared mythology. Like, why are there flood stories in East Asia, Central America, or Polynesia? Perhaps one of the 10 lost tribes of Israel settled in those lands and told them about Noah. The search for these lost peoples may seem like a simple religious or mythological story, but innumerable people have been killed because of their presumed connection to these groups. And of course, as we just learned, the lost tribes are not lost. They were simply assimilated into the Assyrian Empire. So wrapping up the Assyrian Empire, what else is happening in the world at this point?
So we're going to stay in this rough geographical region in the Fertile Crescent, and we're going to talk about the origins of the Israelites. Our very first written mention is in 1207 BCE, and that is this Egyptian pharaoh who's bragging about his military conquests and just how he's taken over the entire world. And he lists off this whole long list of all the people that he's conquered. And at the very end, he says, Israel is laid waste. His seed is no longer.
He said at 1207, like the beginning of the Bronze Age collapse.
Yes,
basically.
exactly. Right then, yeah. So we are going to talk about the origin of this group, the Israelites in the hills of Canaan.
I definitely know the name Canaan, but I don't actually think I know where that is.
Okay, so Canaan is the western part of the Fertile Crescent. So it's like in the southern Levant, and the current countries that occupy that land are Syria and the occupied Palestinian territories and Israel and Jordan. And so, of course, people have lived there for thousands of years because we've been talking about, this geographical location for a long time. But to the outside world, they might be collectively referred to as the Canaanites, but to themselves, they're very different groups of people with different ways of living.
I see. Not one unified civilization or anything.
Yeah, exactly. And so this land has the Mediterranean Sea on one side and then pretty severe desert on the other. And so it kind of creates this corridor that is a very important connection for Egypt to all of the kind of northern kingdoms and empires that Egypt is trying to get to and trade with. So Canaan has sometimes been referred to as the land between. It has very wet summers and it has very dry winters, and that allows the various groups in Canaan to grow like a very standard agricultural package to this whole geographical region, which is like barley and wheat and flax and figs and dates and almonds, and then grapes and olives, which are both important because olives mean olive oil and grapes mean wine. And then those two things are very good commercial products when you're trading. And so as Egypt and all the various kingdoms of Mesopotamia are kind of trampling back and forth over Canaan in order to get to each other, there's also plenty of robust trade with the Canaanites. At some points in history, some groups in Canaan are kind of powerful and have slightly bigger kingdoms and whatnot. And at other times, they're very much being subjugated by either Egypt or a Mesopotamian kingdom.
At some points in history up to this point?
Yeah, up until this point. Yes, sorry. Yeah, up until this point.
Okay.
And we are now going to zero in on one specific group of the Canaanites. As I said, there are groups in Canaan that have kind of bigger kingdoms and like bigger city-states. The group that we're zeroing in on is not one of those. It's not some giant urbanized group. Mm-hmm. Instead, It's just a group of people that live in the hills north of Jerusalem and southwest of the Sea of Galilee. Okay. And they are herders and they're subsistence farmers. And we've found, maybe 250 of these very small communities, like maybe 100 people live in each one. And there they are, just kind of living, somewhat ignoring the mayhem of these big empires that are subjugating other parts of Canaan.
Ignoring meaning like they're not being subjugated or not influenced by it, or?
Well, meaning that they're not powerful enough that they're like important to be beating down all the time.
Okay.
Really, like they're not being warred with, for example. And so what that really means, importantly means, is that they are pretty immune from the Bronze Age collapse. Because as we talked about with the Bronze Age collapse, all the different kingdoms and empires are connected to each other and they domino because of that connection. And so if you're a group that's pretty self-sufficient,
of course,
you kind of are immune to it.
Interesting. Right.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So our group that's in these hills north of Jerusalem are refer to themselves as the Israelites.
Okay.
And they, over time, have kind of divided themselves slightly into two separate geographical regions. And so in the north, that is called Israel, and in the south, that's called Judah. And so it's a situation where all the people who share this whole cultural practice are the Israelites. But then there's also the people from the actual kingdom of Israel, and then the people from the actual kingdom of Judah. So if you say a Judean is also an Israelite, if that makes sense. But an Israelite is not necessarily a Judean.
Okay, yeah. And this group of people has been calling themselves the Israelites since kind of before the Bronze Age collapse and before this bifurcation into the two geographical regions. Is that right?
Yeah, presumably, because this Egyptian pharaoh calls them that in 1207. I mean, we don't, like, that's our first written record, so we don't really know, but I assume he didn't just make that up. Yeah.
Right.
And so again, like in this kind of power vacuum, these communities begin to kind of specialize, and that allows for more robust trade between these little communities, and they just kind of start to grow. And they are worshiping the standard Canaanite deities. So among those is the god El. So if you can like hear Hebrew words like reverberating in your brain, you can like hear that word, like Bethel, which means house of God, or Elohim, or Israel, which is he who struggled with God.
So yes. El is just one of the many gods that they worship?
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. Okay.
At this point, yeah.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, and so the northern section of Israel is a little bit greener and more fertile, and so it develops a little bit earlier. And in kind of the 800s BCE, we start to see like bigger administrative buildings and palaces and fortifications and kind of all the, the signs of a sort of thriving urban
city situation.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Exactly. Okay. And until eventually we get the Omride dynasty, and that is like the big, huge dynasty of this northern kingdom of Israel. And it's named after, as is very normal, named after the first, like this kind of founding king. And so he's this Israelite general who becomes the king named Omri. And he and his son just really build and expand this huge northern empire of Israel. And they center the whole thing around this capital city of Samaria, which is not to be confused with Sumer, which is S-U. This is S-A. Right. And they fight the Assyrians, who we know are a pretty formidable, foe at this point. The Assyrian Empire, as we know, because we were just learning about them, are a little bit unstoppable. So, this small kingdom of Israel is not really a match for them. And so in some ways, the history of the next 100 years is kind of the encroachment of the Assyrians on Israel. And then again, dipping a little bit into our next episode's timeline, as we said, in about 720 BCE, there's this last king of Israel, Hosea, and he becomes the king by having his predecessor assassinated. So I don't know what to say about that, but he does. And and he fights them off. And at this point, the entire kingdom of Israel is basically like an island around this capital city of Samaria. I think it's been pretty small, it's very much shrunk. And Samaria is besieged for 3 years. Like this king Hosea fights them off, but eventually, there's no fighting the Assyrians. And so eventually it falls. And this is the point where the Assyrian Empire just deports massive amounts of people into itself, into other parts of Assyria. Yeah.
It deports the Israelites into Assyria.
Exactly.
Wow. Right.
Yeah. And so what that means is that people take refuge by going south into the kingdom of Judah.
You're saying some people are being deported into the Assyrian Empire. The people who aren't are kind of fleeing from that.
Exactly. So many people flee south into Judah. And it's at this point that the kingdom of Judah kind of rises up. And so, as we said, when we were talking about Assyria, this group of people that ends up being deported out of the kingdom of Israel is what's known as the 10 lost tribes of Israel. And that's where sort of that whole story and sense of loss comes from.
Gotcha. Okay. Is that a wrap on the Israel section for now?
Yes, that is a wrap. We'll be back in our next episode.
Cool. So where do we go now?
So now we're going to go over to India, and we're going to talk about the Vedic period.
Nice. Well, we haven't been to India since the Indus in episode 2. I've been wondering what's going on.
Yes, that's very true. That's very true. The Vedic period is a really important time in Indian history. It has a huge influence over Indian culture from now on. This is the time when the Vedas were written, which, the Vedas are the foundational texts of Hinduism, which is the world's oldest active religion. More than 1 billion people practice it currently. And so we're going to talk about that, the time period in which they were written. And so, as you just said, we talked about the Harappan civilization or the Indus Valley civilization back in episode 2. And so that was that group in northern India on the border of Pakistan, which has this complex urban culture, large cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, and it has writing and it has underground plumbing, and it just has this whole kind of incredible culture that doesn't seem to have rigid power structures and whatnot. And so that's where we left India.
Right. If anyone's listening that hasn't listened to that episode about the Indus, you got to go back and listen to it because it's really cool.
Yeah,
it's my favorite
really cool.
place we've talked about, I think.
It's pretty cool. And so when we finished talking about them, we sort of briefly mentioned that there was an influx of these nomadic people as the Indus Valley civilization was kind of vanishing. And so that group of people is the Indo-Aryans, and they came from the steppe of Asia. And just just slight side note, the word Aryan, which in our modern ears is like a very racial term, doesn't have anything to do with race at this time. It's just referring to this group of people. Our best guess is that this is just kind of a gradual migration of people coming from the steppe of Western Asia, probably through Iran, and then gradually kind of coming into India and probably interacting with the Indus Valley civilization. It's very unclear how much cross-cultural exchange there were versus if it was kind of unrelated that they showed up in the Indus Valley, disappeared, But anyway, roughly at this time, this, more and more migrants are coming from the north. This group brought with them horses and chariots and Sanskrit. I mean, that's, a big thing. That was the language that they brought with them. And then the belief system and all the cultural practices that go along with Vedic culture. So they brought Vedic culture with them and the Vedas. So for whatever variety of reasons, the kind of culture in India, which had been these large urban centers, kind of disappears at this time and becomes much more nomadic. And as you just said, of course, the people in the Indus Valley were writing. The group of people who come from the north aren't. And so they bring the Vedas, but they bring them as an oral tradition.
Sanskrit at this point isn't just an oral language. It's
a spoken language. Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Rather than a written one. So there's 4 Vedas, and they are considered the oldest Hindu texts, and they're filled with hymns and wisdom and instructions about how to live your life and how to practice various rituals, including the sacrificing of animals. There's histories and math and astronomy and philosophy and everything that you would expect in a religious cultural piece of writing. The word Vedas means that which was known or knowledge. And so the idea is that they're uncreated truth. The Vedas are uncreated truth. They're just truth that exists in the world. And there were these ancient sages called rishi that could hear this uncreated truth and this knowledge. And so they spoke it so that other humans who weren't sages could hear it.
Okay.
And so the job of each generation is to pass down this recitation exactly. And so each generation teaches the next generation how to recite with complete precision. And so the students of the Vedas can literally recite it forwards and backwards. It's like exactly the tones, the pronunciation, etc., is the same.
Wow.
And so although they didn't get written down into written Sanskrit for several hundred years, at least theoretically, they've been passed exactly. And that's still happening today. These are still being chanted at weddings and funerals like today.
Wow, that's so cool.
Yeah, it's really, really cool. They're the longest continually used sacred texts.
Okay, let me try to see if I understand this all exactly. So the Indo-Aryans come to India through Iran. They're speaking Sanskrit, and they come with this tradition, this Vedic tradition, somewhat established already, and they continue on with it, sort of teaching, and as an oral tradition, they're passing on this that which is known. They're passing on a cultural, spiritual, religious practice. And then eventually, some hundreds of years later, that oral tradition gets written down in Sanskrit.
Yep.
And that's the Vedas that we still have, the 4 Vedas.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay.
And so the earliest hymns in the Rig Veda, which is the earliest Veda, are, we think were composed or heard and began to be recited around 1500 BCE. And in the Rig Veda, which is this oldest one, is this idea that there's a primary person which has different types of people representing the different parts of its body. So it calls the priests and teachers are its mouth, and the warriors and the rulers are its arms, and the merchants and traders are its legs, and the workers and peasants are its feet. And this is the earliest recorded writing that we have about the Varnas, or, what we call the caste system eventually.
Okay.
And in this early writing, it's very unclear. The word Varna is translated to mean something much more like class than caste. And the difference being like, people can be a warrior, people can be a laborer, and they can just happen to be that. And in a caste system, it means that you're born into that. So your birth and your inheritance is this role. And so that is certainly what it eventually becomes. Yeah. But whether or not that's what the Rig Veda meant is like very, it's very unclear that it meant you're born into it.
And you're dwelling on it because there's Indian historians that are tracing the lineage of the caste system potentially to the Rig Veda.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's sort of like everywhere in all cultures across the world, whenever there's like injustices happening and everyone's trying to use every historical writing and every philosophical writing to justify or fight against it. And this is just one of those examples where if you're trying to hold the caste system up, you can be like, look, the Rig Veda says, and if you're not trying to do that, you can be like, no, it doesn't, and so, exactly. I mean, it just feels like a very familiar argument, basically anywhere in the world. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. And sorry, one more question, just clarifying, because I think I know like somewhat about the caste system, but you said it, just basically the caste system didn't allow for like any class or social mobility at all, essentially. Like you were born into a thing and it was very rigid. You stayed there and there was a specific hierarchy of society that was maintained from the time of your birth until you died, and you couldn't really avoid it.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, at different points, I mean, this goes on for a couple thousand years in Indian history. And so at different points, it looks very different. And in different places, it looks very different, but more or less. Right. Yeah.
Okay.
And so the last thing I want to do, which is a little bit ridiculous to even try, is just to really quickly summarize Hinduism, which, we'll do with all the world's major religions, like as they come up. And of course, it's ridiculous to summarize a religion in like 2 minutes. And please go read 10 books and I'll, recommend them on the website.
I think I need to write like a little like, talk show jingle for this moment. Like, dun, 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 Ellie summarizes world religion.
Okay, so in Hinduism, there is one universal god or soul, which is known as the Brahman. And that is what everything is and what everything is made of. The metaphor you see over and over again is the ocean. And so drops come out of it and sort of give an illusion of separateness. But ultimately, it's all one thing. At the center of each person is a piece of that universal God, and that is known as your Atma. And also inside a person is their Jivatma, which is loosely translated as a soul. And that is in a cycle of death and rebirth. And what you want as a human is to achieve moksha, which is liberation from this cycle of death and rebirth. And that happens by realizing your oneness with the Brahman.
Okay, just like as soon as you realize you're freed of it, kind of.
Yeah. And so that ends your suffering, like that enlightenment, that realization, like ends your suffering and, gives you eternity, basically, because you become part of this eternal God. There are 4 main paths or yogas to achieve this unity or this liberation, and some may speak more readily to you than others, and they're the paths of knowledge, of love, of duty, or of meditation, like achieving it by looking inside your own mind. And of course, these words don't translate exactly. In Hinduism, there's the concept of karma. So the Hindu universe is perfectly moral. Everyone gets exactly what they deserve. So your thoughts and your actions in your past life affect this life, and your thoughts and actions in this life will affect your next one. And so you can live a good life by adhering to your dharma. And so your dharma, again, hard to translate, but it's kind of like the idea of your duty or your role or your ethics. It's like your job in this world. So the dharma of a lion is to chase a gazelle. The dharma of a person depends on your age and your station in life and your gender. And so an elderly priest has a different dharma than a young laborer, for example. And so when the Earth's dharma is out of balance, an avatar, which is the material incarnation of a deity, comes and helps restore the balance. So avatar means descent in Sanskrit. And so it's, a deity descends to the earth. And so that brings us to the Hindu pantheon. And so Hinduism has hundreds of gods, but it might be that for many people, they're understood as more like manifestations of one God. In the Vedas and in the Bhagavad Gita, the language is very much like the one God. It's very singular, and that the different gods are manifestations of that God. So having said that, at the center is essentially a trinity, which is Brahma, the creator, and Vishnu, the preserver, and Shiva, the destroyer. Depending on exactly what type of Hinduism you practice and where you live geographically and when you live in time, different gods and different religious texts might be more held up, be more sacred.
You said the Bhagavad Gita. What is that?
That is another very, very important Hindu text. It's written a little bit later, which is why we didn't talk about it right now. But it's, it's incredibly foundational, very important, very sacred.
Interesting. Okay, that's the lightning summary of Hinduism there.
Yeah. And again, please go read more. Use that as the smallest jumping off place.
Right. And I imagine we will be talking quite a bit more about it, considering it's like a massive world religion today.
100%. Yeah. We're going to be back in India in the episode after the next, because that's when the Buddha is born. And so, yeah, Hinduism will keep coming up for sure.
Okay, I've been so excited to talk about this because the timeline for this episode covers the timeline of the 6th cradle of civilization that you foreshadowed long ago, right?
Yes, exactly. We're going to talk about our 6th cradle of civilization, and it is all the way on the other side of the world again, and it's in Mesoamerica. And Mesoamerica is the modern day countries of southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, El Salvador, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, that whole stretch. And in that space, a massive civilization grows centering in northeastern Mexico, so right near the Gulf Coast. And they are known to us as the Olmecs. What's particularly interesting about this group of people is that we don't actually really even know if they would have thought of themselves as a group of people. We are looking back without the ability to read their writing, which we'll talk about in a minute, and without much cultural context at an archaeological package that looks similar over a big space. You know, we're like, we see this type of art here and we see that same type of art over there. Therefore, they're the same. Mm-hmm. And that may have been true or it may not have been true. So we talk about the Olmecs. What we actually don't know is if everyone we're referring to as the Olmecs even spoke the same language or would have thought of themselves as the same as each other.
Okay, and clearly not as distinct as like had the same ruler. We don't know that.
We really don't. However, one thing that's very interesting about the Olmecs is that there's 3 major sites, you know, like big cities, big, you know, urban centers, and they kind of exist in succession. And they don't really have any other peers at the time. So San Lorenzo is the first one. And so what I'm saying is that when at the height of that urban center, there weren't a bunch of other urban centers right around, like in Mesopotamia, for example, where, you know, was there, but also Uruk was there.
Right. So you're saying San Lorenzo was one isolated city, more or less, without a whole bunch of cities being right nearby.
Yeah, exactly. And so what that maybe leads us to think is the idea that that is the center of this culture and that the people around may pay tribute to them, but that's kind of its capital. So maybe that's the way it is, and this is all one group of people that thinks of itself as a group, but we don't actually know that. So the height of this city, San Lorenzo, is between 1200 and 900 BCE. So it fits right neatly into the timeline of this episode. Mm-hmm. And it's on a plateau near a river. This whole land is a land of shifting rivers and creeks and oxbow lakes. It's very, very wet and it's very hot. It's described as the land that tastes of water, which I think is the most poetic thing I've ever heard. But
yeah, that's cool.
It does make archaeology very difficult, unfortunately, because that's not a land that preserves things as well as, you know, some other ones.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So San Lorenzo is built on a plateau that's artificial down 7 meters. So it's on the banks of this river, but then it's been built up 7 entire meters.
What the heck?
I know. Again, the volume.
What is with people doing this, dude? What
I know. Well,
I
mean, I'm assuming it's about flooding, but it's just the work is. I mean, just the labor is unimaginable.
I'm just like low key, put it somewhere else. You know.
Well, I presume maybe good defense. Anyway, I don't know. And it's huge. So it's 700 hectares of space.
Okay.
So Uruk in Mesopotamia is about half of that. Harappa in the Indus is 150. So San Lorenzo is very big.
Jesus. Okay.
So this platform, which again was moved by baskets, just like in Poverty Point, is somewhere between 500,000 and 200,000 cubic meters of dirt. So just, you know, it's just unimaginable. So on this platform are homes and residences of elite people. Also on that platform are temples and other types of administrative buildings, including one particularly impressive residence, which is called the Red Palace. And there's all kinds of things like obsidian and jade and serpentine, you know, which comes all the way from like Guatemala or Oaxaca or, you know, from far away. So there's lots of exchange of goods with people that are very far away. Again, we're not sure exactly what the political relationship is, but clearly there's robust exchange of goods happening.
Cool. So we've got serious social hierarchy. We've got trade and currency.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a proper city.
And again, because this is, Mesoamerica, their diet is like on point. So they have domesticated gourds, fruit trees, squash, beans, avocados, chocolate, chilies, fish, and then corn, which again,
dude,
I know, I'm like, it's just really
solid. We have to talk about corn. Its domestication is one of the craziest agricultural feats ever. The closest wild relative to maize or corn is a group of wild grasses called teosintes. Most of the time when we see a domesticated grain, the relationship to its wild ancestors is pretty obvious. If you look up a picture of wild emmer, for example, it looks pretty much like the wheat that it eventually became. Teosinte's relationship to corn, on the other hand, is not obvious at all. Teosinte looks different, it's short, it is barely edible with dubious nutritional value, it's difficult to harvest, and it has less than 20 kernels. In other words, none of the traits that make a modern ear of corn valuable could be seen by looking at the ancestor. And these traits are genetic. Each one requires precise selection to modify from generation to generation. Some are controlled by over 10 distinct genes, making the selection of desirable traits unimaginably slow and complicated if you remember your single gene Punnett squares from middle school. And it may go without saying, but the ancient people who did all this selective breeding did not have a modern ear of corn to work towards. It's pretty easy to see how so many cultures and peoples put corn into an almost divine category. Somehow, these incredible plant breeders turned a shrimpy little grass into a golden ear of corn. We don't completely understand how they did it, but we do have a vague timeline. Maize began to be domesticated in around 7000 BCE in southern Mexico. By 4800 BCE, we see forest clearance for maize cultivation in the Tabasco region of Mexico. By the year 0, maize was a crucial part of almost every diet on 2 entire continents. And in 2022, the world grew 1.15 trillion kilograms of maize.
So the Olmecs are very famous for their incredible art and their statuary. And people who know a lot about art, which isn't really me, talk about its naturalism. Later on, in a lot of Mesoamerican cultures, the art is very stylized. And here, it's not as much like that. So their most famous art is, of course, their iconic stone heads, which are these massive, massive heads of their rulers. And every source I looked at gave a different range for their exact size, but they're like between 1 and 3 meters tall, and they weigh thousands of kilograms. Like, they're just huge.
Right.
But then the really, really crazy thing is that the stone, the volcanic stone that they're made from, is sourced in the Tuxtla Mountains, which are 60 to 120 kilometers away.
This is some Egyptian pyramid nonsense here.
I know, because there aren't draft animals in Mesoamerica, which makes it even more wild than the Egyptian pyramids.
Oh my.
No draft animals, and these things weigh thousands of kilograms. So they somehow got these rocks that weigh thousands of kilograms 100 kilometers. And people sort of say casually in books like, well, they transferred them on rafts on rivers. I'm like, well, that doesn't really clarify to me how they did that, like, specifically.
Hell no. How did they move them 1 inch? I don't care about how they moved them once they're on a raft.
Yeah. No, it's really, really, I mean, yeah. I mean, as we've said so many times, just the feats of like engineering and artistry.
Yeah.
Well, they're just mind-boggling. Each one of the heads has a very specific headdress on it. And in later Mesoamerican cultures, people had identifiers on their headdresses. So one of the things about the Olmecs in general is that you see all these precursors to things that become very common in many, many later Mesoamerican cultures. in groups. And that is clearly in their art, their headwork, their headdresses, like we were just saying. It's also true about the religion, their sports, their writing. So there's like a kind of famous game that you might be able to picture where people play with like a rubber ball in an arena. And that is like, a big game in many Mesoamerican cultures. That starts here. The earliest version of the Mesoamerican calendar starts with the Olmecs.
Okay.
And the pantheon of the Mesoamerican gods is also clearly has its origins here. So there's lots of were-jaguar babies, like a werewolf, like a were-jaguar. There's a lot of like mixing like animal-like gods, animals and people. There's the maize god is everywhere, which is, again, a god that is very important in later cultures. And there are lots of imagery of twins, which is important throughout future Mesoamerican religions and creation stories. The Olmecs are big adopters and big spreaders of written language. We're actually not totally sure if they invented it or if they borrowed it from somebody else, but certainly they spread it widely and they used it widely. Interestingly, we have some tablets and some artifacts that look like writing from as early as 1000 BCE, but the language or the markings on those tablets don't seem to be related to the language that we know that the Olmecs actually wrote a little bit later.
Okay.
Which, very interesting. So I don't know what the story is, when the shift happened, or maybe the first thing isn't writing. We're not sure.
Yeah. Cool.
Really, really interesting. And then again, the calendar. And so the Mesoamerican calendar is this incredibly important thing, that a lot of people associate with the Mayans. And the earliest date that we have on it is actually 36 BCE. It's actually December 8th, which is my birthday, 36 BCE. So that's not, that's many episodes away from where we are now, which is only in 800 BCE. But it's this group, it's the Olmecs who eventually develop that calendar. So San Lorenzo goes along, is kind of the center of this culture as far as we can tell until about 900 BCE. It sort of fades, and this other city seems to replace it in a slightly different group and becomes the major central site, and that is La Venta, and that's there from 900 to about 400 BCE.
Okay.
And there we get pyramids, which look very much like the ones that appear in later Mesoamerican societies. Okay. And then that one wanes in 400 BCE, and yet a third site appears, and that's in the mountains. And that one is called Tres Zapatos. And, we'll circle back to them in several episodes and talk about the Mayan calendar. And that is kind of the end of our world tour between 1200 BCE and 800 BCE. And we have all of our cradles of civilization on the table.
We've completed them. Nice.
Yes, we're cradled up.
And with that, we come to the end of our fourth call, covering the years from 1200 to 800 BCE, in which we witnessed the Bronze Age collapse, the rise of giant iron empires, the origins of the Israelite, Vedic, and Mesoamerican cultures. In our next episode, we will cover the years 800 to 575 BCE. We will visit the Bantu people on their expansion across southern and central Africa. We'll see the fall of the Assyrian Empire and the rise of a new empire, which takes the Israelites captive. We will see the origins of the alphabet, and finally, spend time with the 10,000-year-old Jomon culture in Japan. Bye, Ellie.
Bye, Charlie.
World History 24 is written and researched by Ellie Cazella. I do the production and music. Our logo and design work is done by Alyssa Alarcon Santo. For links to any sources mentioned in the episode, as well as lots of fascinating extra material, including a video of me recording the Hurrian hymn number 6, visit worldhistory24.com. You can also find information there about how to support this podcast. That's worldhistory24.com. My name is Charlie Cazella, and on behalf of myself and my sister, thank you for listening, and we will see you next hour.